this is the 3T Strada Italia, made in Italy by Italians. Let's take a closer look. It's raw, rigid and rapid. 3T Strada Italia then. Let's take a look under the hood. I want to get really close up, because when you're charging this much money for a frame, I think every single little detail is going to be important. And this is the only bike I know of that even comes close to Time's manufacturing process. So you can probably see in this raw format, this is still resin transfer molded, which means that rather than going in two sides of a mold and closing it up with lots of sheets of pre-preg, what they do is they weave around like a solid black, normally wax, and they put it into a mold and then inject resin through it, almost like bleeding a brake essentially. So you get much fewer voids and air bubbles in, I guess, in that in the resin. Now the key difference between 3T's process and Time's is that 3T filament wind as opposed to Time when they weave. So Time is much more like weaving a sock or a scarf or something like that, where this is much more a machine that goes round and round and round, and you can see that play out in the pattern. Now just looking at this, you can see which bits are filament wound and which bits aren't. So the tubing, there's a join here and there's a join here. This is similar to what you find on Time bikes. They're constructed the same way. You know, all the joins are made molded and then bonded together with all these parts. So when it's framed like this, you can see where that filament wounding process works here, and then this whole complex shape, slightly different construction method, and how it's reinforced with some 4K. This looks like it's woven here, and then down here it's joined again at the dropouts. Really, I want to take a look at this bottom bracket area, so get this crankset off and have a look. I know this bike hasn't been used very much, but there's no evidence there of any sort of under rotation mark. Now this is actually a BB386evo bottom bracket, but even though you can see these teeth here, it's actually a thread together bottom bracket, so I need to find the tool and see if we can get this undone. It looks like a token bottom bracket that comes with it, which would be pretty cool if it is. Now, ironically, with all these bottom bracket tools that I have, the best one that actually fits is the Wheels Manufacturing 48mm. This is a pretty good fit. So there will be one person out there watching this video sweating right now, because this was actually built by one of our ex-mechanics who's now working for the importers of 3T bikes. Bottom bracket removed, we can now see this really asymmetric design. I don't think it is properly asymmetric. I think it's just how it's been designed like this. But here on the non-drive side, there's almost a virtually smooth transition into that bottom bracket area. Over here on the drive side, you can see there's like this little lip. Okay, so this should be a standard 86.9. And this is coming up a little bit on the wide side. 87 should really be 86.5. Using our bore micrometer. So this is, that would be 45.95 at this point here, and we keep turning. We're a little bit over, probably 46.1, 46.2. So this is our go, no-go gauge. This is 46.95, and yeah, sure enough, that just goes straight in. But yeah, even the 46, probably a little bit on the big side. That's disappointing. And on the non-drive side, yeah, 0.97 again. There we have a relatively snug fit. And yet that won't go in. So the non-drive side, I would say, is virtually perfect. 45.97 on average. The drive side, however, is a little bit oversized. Now, this could be because of the bottom bracket that is installed. Remember, the non-drive side is a press fit on this, and the mechanic that installed this would have had to have tightened this up. So you have got some kind of abrasion going on, even between a smooth aluminium surface and a smooth carbon surface. There'll be some sort of abrasion that goes on to get this to rotate. This is why I don't really like these thread together solutions. But so we don't know what situation it was like before this was installed, but right now it doesn't look good. Okay, dropouts then. Let's take a look at this. First of all, the axles you get are the Syntace ones, the X12s. It's good quality axle. And down here, what we're looking for is a completely clean interface, that there's no clear coat or obstruction to where that wheel and axle has to sit. That looks okay. In here, there's quite a lot of detritus, and this has some roughness to it, sadly. It's like almost a pitting just gone on here. There's another little, almost like a hole I can get my pick into there. Now, on the drive side, we do have a SRAM UDH, which is quite exciting to see. So with the SRAM UDH, we want to make sure that this surface here is actually quite clean, because it is fairly important that the whole mech hanger can rotate if it needs to. There is here a little section you can see where the clear coat is lifted, but that's a clean interface. There's a little void just there. You can see where my pick is getting stuck. So you do have the option here running Shimano Di2, but there's no way you can run mechanical. You'll be able to get a small Di2 cable through there, but that's definitely not going to work. Now, an interesting point here, you can see that they're both separate depths, which means that when you have to build one of these, you're going to have to buy different length bolts here to account for that. Not quite sure why they have done that. That's a very peculiar thing to have done. Top of this looks okay. This is a little bit messy, but that looks good. And it is nice and flat. I can't feel a ridge or anything there, and it's nice and clean underneath as well. So what I'm doing here is clamping down with one side, and I'm making sure that the other side here is still perfectly flat. It looks pretty good, and if I press on this side, again, this should be perfectly flat. Okay, with the wheel out, we can see a bit more of the intricate detailing around here. Now, similar design to the Look RS blade, so we've got this slightly flared and then seat stays come down here rather than just joining straight onto the seat post like this. And you can see where they've had to reinforce that with this extra layer of carbon around here. It's actually quite nice to see sort of the reinforcement that they've done. So I do quite like looking at, you know, the carbon frames and working out how they've engineered the strength into it. It looks nice. Okay, obviously with this situation, you don't get an awful lot of adjustment with your seat post. You've literally only got a few inches worth before you're going to need to start thinking about cutting the seat post down. Front axle is pretty much the same as the back. They all look nice and clean. Now, the one thing with this is that the flat mount system isn't what you're used to seeing. So the bolts actually go all the way through the fork, similar to what we see from Rondo. So it's this flat area here that we're looking for, rather than the two threads higher up. Coming to the stem, and this is all a 3T proprietary piece. The two bolts that hold this on at the back here are a little 4mm, but I can't use my standard wearer because it has this shoulder. So I've just gone to get a different Allen key, which means I can get into there a little bit deeper. There's also a rather interesting thing here where there's actually a little hole here, and this is so that you can check that you've got the minimum insertion, so you should be able to feel something solid behind there, which is okay. Now we can see the setup. So it's not a normal 1/8 steerer, it's got a D shape to it, and then there is this metal block here. So what we're moving is this clamp bolt here. So this piece here is metal, and this is a coarse finish, and then this is a wedge, so that this will wedge into this gap here, hold everything together. And the setup we've got here is sort of semi-integrated, so the cables don't go fully through the stem, they sort of sit in this channel here. You can see these two beefy bolts on the back here that are quite hidden, and then the sort of clip system on the top. So it looks nice and clean from the front. And then we're into the headset. So what we have is this orange compression nut with a channel here for the two cables. This is all pretty familiar stuff. So what we've got here is a very small bearing, tiny little thing in fact. And then down the bottom here, I can imagine that we've also got a relatively small bearing. So we do have a Cane Creek bearing in there, so fairly standard size. So good to see we've got good quality bearings down there. Now, the work that I'm doing on this is something that if you've got internal cable routing like this, you can do yourself to help maintain your bearings. So the biggest killer of your headset bearings are going to be rust. So if you've been out on a really wet ride, you've not put it away properly, it's really worth, if you can, get to this level of disassembly, dry everything, keep everything dry, don't let moisture get into here, and then you can go through and then put fresh grease in. So right, while we're down here, a quick look at this crown race, and this is beautifully clean. I'm loving the attention on this fork here. This is very good. And the surface on the inside here all looks good too. Just while we're here, we can see again this 4K weave pattern alongside a very different pattern on the fork. There's no filament winding going on here. This is almost like strips of carbon along here. There's a very different look to it, but just the only sort of weave you can see is just around this crown. The handlebars, of course, are a 3T piece as well. Of course, that's where 3T is really famous. They really were born out of a handlebar stem seat post company. The frame sets very much came second, and been making finishing kit for a long time, so they should be excellent. A couple of options here with the cable routing, which is a bit strange because there's a cable routing hole here, which seems pretty redundant to be honest. But I think if you had Di2, you could definitely route a Di2 cable through there if you wanted to hook it up to your battery. Of course, you don't have to now that it's wireless, but that option is there still. Okay, I think the verdict is I am somewhat impressed. I don't think it is as good as at times. There's a couple of imperfections there, but it is generally of a very, very high standard, and very, very brave of them to expose and show you exactly how the carbon is constructed like this. Generally speaking, the bits that really matter, the headset, I think this bottom bracket would have been okay if they weren't fitting something like this. Right, let's get this back together and out on the road. It has the resin transfer moulding of a tie, but filament wound. The nose is very specialised SL8, albeit a little bit longer, perhaps a little bit more Roman. Fork, somewhat similar. The down tube is very reminiscent of a Pinarello Dogma. This whole setup here, very Cervelo S5 Scott foil. And at the back, you have a SRAM UDH, so gravel, and 35mm tyre clearance. But the only thing that I'd say is distinctively 3T design about it is this whole stem, which is quite vintage 3T design really. Actually, what I do quite like about this bike, completely unrelated, is the saddle. It's from a company called Repente. Never really come across them before. They're quite sort of flat and shallow. And it's actually quite rigid to sit on. I think I've missed that. I've been riding around one of those 3D printed things. It's quite soft and cushioned. I actually really like it. Just a solid saddle. It's just a nice shape. I'm gonna go and learn some more about them. I'll let you know how that goes. The whole design reminds me of one of those mental sports cars. Not one of the nice elegant Ferraris, but like a Zonda or something like that, or a Lamborghini, where it's all like just optimized for aerodynamics and stuff, regardless of how it looks. And we'll try and make it look as aesthetically pleasing as we can. I expect this to be very rigid to ride. Let's go find out. Some first ride impressions in. One, it's quieter than I expected. And I mean that because normally when you get bikes with really big down tubes, like the Pinarello Dogma, they vibrate. It's just, they sort of sound like a drum and they make a lot of noise. This, probably the loudest part of the bike is probably coming from those really large tyres. Tyre noise is probably significant, but 35s on a race bike, come on. This should really be 30s. Saddle, really impressed with. More on that in a second. And it is rigid. It's not even stiff. It is just absolute, steadfast, solid. I like it. This should be 3R, straw, rigid and rapid. This bike is actually a right giggle, in the same sort of way as I imagine a really high spec performance race car, sort of like a Pagani Zonda or something, with all the roll cages and carbon fibre, would be absolute grin-inducing blast for an hour or so. And then after that, I'd imagine it would get quite tiresome. This is a bit the same. You can throw it around corners, you can thrash it around like a lunatic, and it's a lot of fun. But once you've done some hours, not so much, which is surprising, because I really thought that the big 35mm tyres compensate for that. Certainly made it a lot of fun descending, but I'm definitely feeling that extra weight on the climbs. Now, I'm pretty sure it's not the frame that I'm feeling, because these are heavy tyres, pretty deep wheels. And I think that's probably impacted its climbing ability more than the frame. The frame is plenty stiff enough. I think with a nice lighter set of wheels, you could really thrash this. Right, some sort of conclusion then. But before we get to that, please think about subscribing to the channel, because if you do, a larger number of subscribers means that more brands like 3T are interested in sending us stuff to review so you can enjoy videos like this. Generally, I quite like it. It's a very quirky design that has got to be a love or a hate thing. It's definitely got some character, that's for sure. Whether it would be the only bike in my stable, I don't think so. I can see myself owning one as a second bike. Maybe I've got my bike that I do my long distance cycling on, and this is like my get out for a fast and furious thrash around the local trails, or take it to a race course, ride it at a crit, that sort of thing. I don't see myself riding it except in those sort of niche situations. I think these fat tyres do the bike a bit of a disservice. I think it'd be much better with some nice lightweight 30s. Great for when you're just on the flats and descending, but you can really feel the extra weight of those tyres. That doesn't really reflect on the frame, it's just an observation of using really fat tyres on a race bike situation. Bit weird. There we go, lovely bike. A little bit of a shame that the bottom bracket's oversized. Maybe that's a design feature to fit that thread together. Bottom bracket, probably suspect it isn't. Right, I hope you liked that video. See you on the next one really soon.